Hello, this is Maria Williams. Today I'm making a spinner card that was inspired by the reveal wheel and also a card that Jennifer McGuire posted not too long ago. And I'm using these products from Pinkfresh Studio. Pinkfresh is a new brand to me, and this is a really cute set of stamps and dies called Ski and Buy. And there was a little bonus with the dies. I didn't realize this until I got them, that these dies come with a magnetic sheet. So I will probably put the magnetic sheet on top of the paper in the packaging so that my dies don't move around as much as they do right now. But that was a nice little surprise. And then I'm going to be using for my sentiment this Altenew mini Christmas stamp. I believe it's on sale right now. It came out last year. And then I'm also going to be using this Snow Much Fun paper pack. I thought it would be perfect with these stamps and dies. So those are the basic supplies. I'm also going to be using a couple of Distress Oxide inks for my stamping. I'm using Bundled Sage and Stormy Sky. And of course you could use dye-based inks for this as well. I just happen to have these handy. I had just used Stormy Sky, so I just kind of stuck with the Distress Oxide inks. To get started, I've got my card base cut out of 110-pound Neenah Solar White. Is my favorite white cardstock to use for card bases. And then I also have a panel that is cut to the same size as my card, which is 4¼ by 5½. And I also have some extra pieces of cardstock. So the first thing I'm going to do is prepare the pieces for my mechanism. I have a scallop die here from Spellbinders. This one is really old. And I wanted to point out that Spellbinders dies don't have the cutting blade or the cutting edge right at the edge of the die. So I prefer dies like the Sizzix ones that you see here. These are actually from Stampin' Up, where the cutting edge is right at the edge of the die. That way you can see exactly where you're cutting. But since I'm just cutting a shape out of a piece of cardstock, this is not really an issue. But what you need here is just some kind of scalloped shape, scalloped circle. You don't want to do, well, you could do a plain circle, but then it would be harder to turn the mechanism. The other thing is that you want your die cut to be as close to the width of the card as possible. So here I'm just finding the center of my scallop circle die. So I'm just making sure that I have an equal number of scallops on either side of the ruler edge and just marking the center. And this won't show, so it doesn't matter if you use a pencil or a pen. If you mark around the scallops like I'm doing, you may want to erase that because you will see the back of the wheel, the back of the die cut once the card is finished. Next, you want to punch a hole through that center that you have marked. This is where you will later place a brad. So once you make the hole in the die cut, you will want to place it onto your card front, the panel that is cut to the same size of the card base, and make a hole in that as well. Make sure that you have your die cut really well centered on the card front because this will make a big difference in how the card turns out in the end. Once you've punched the hole, but before you move your die cut at all, mark 3 of the scallops, the ones that are going to be all the way to the right, so that you know where to cut the groove in the card so that you can turn the die cut. And then you are also going to need 2 more circles. Mine are about 1 3/4 inches. I use that size because I had a punch. They don't have to be exactly that size, but that is a good size, and you'll see it'll become more clear a little bit later. You need to find the center in both of these smaller circles as well. So what I did is punch a circle out of just some printer paper and folded it in half 2 different ways and marked the center of that circle that way. So I'm just going to use that as my guide to punch the holes in the smaller circles. And then one of the circles, I'll need to make that hole a little bit bigger. This is not absolutely necessary, but it'll really help with the assembly later on. So I couldn't find my really basic hole punch, so I'm using my Crocodile, but you definitely don't need a tool this size just to make that hole bigger. And if you don't have a hole punch, you could also use a really small circle die. Now you want to take the circle that has the just the hole punch, the little hole punch through it, line it up with the scallop circle die cut, and place a brad through both of those two pieces. I'm going to go ahead and place some foam squares onto the smaller circle. Now I'm not going to peel off the back or paper, but this way it's ready for assembly later. I'm using one of the papers from the 6x6 paper stack, and of course you could use any paper you like here. I could have easily used the light blue one, the light blue that was designed that's on the other side of this piece, but I kind of like the dark color for a change. So I'm just using some purple tape. I know I said in my previous video that I really like that Scotch repositionable tape, but since everybody's been using this purple tape, I thought I would give it a try. I actually really like it, and so just using the Mountain Edge die from the Ski and Buy die set and cutting out the paper. So I'm just going to use some Nuvo glue. This is the first time I'm using this glue. We'll see how I like it. And it is a little bit more liquid than the Ranger Multimedia Matte that I use pretty much all the time. So I did struggle a little bit with it with the assembly, but I think it's just a matter of getting used to it. I actually really like it. It dried pretty quickly, so I'm glad I tried it. At this point, I am re-punching the notch where the scallop circle will poke out, and I will have to erase the rest of those lines. And then I also need to die cut a larger circle where I poked the hole earlier. I'm using a circle die that is probably about an inch and a quarter in diameter. And then I'm going to set this aside and work on stamping and die cutting the little critters that are going to go on the card. I'm going to color my little critters with Copic markers, so I'm using VersaFine Black Onyx ink. You could definitely use Memento ink as well. And then I'm going to die cut all the shapes. I've also previously cut a sort of a stencil with the slope die that comes in the Ski and Buy set, and I'm going to use that to add a little bit of detail to my front panel. I'm now erasing those pencil lines that I mentioned earlier, and then I'm taking the stencil that I cut earlier, which by the way, I don't think I mentioned that I cut it out of Duralar. This is a new material to me, and I will have another video down the road where I cut out some stencils. I like the way the embossing works on this as well, so I think it's a great alternative to vellum, but more on that on a future video. So I'm taking the stencil with one of these scrapbook.com ink blending tools. It's similar to the Ranger one, except that their pads are domed instead of flat. They're supposed to help with ink blending and not getting big circle marks. You can still get a little too much ink if you go directly from the ink pad to the cardstock, but they did seem to work pretty well. So I just want a fairly faint line, so I check frequently as I'm inking just to make sure that I don't get too harsh a line, and then I reposition my stencil and again ink up my dauber and make one more line, and I felt like 2 slopes were good enough. Then I took a stamp from the set that has 2 trees, and I put my stencil back along the inked line and used it as a mask because the smaller tree on the right actually has a longer tree trunk, and I didn't want it to extend past my slope, so I just used my stencil as a mask. To color the critters, I'm using a pretty small number of Copic markers. I use BG70 and BG72 to color the little sweaters on the 2 mice. And then I used N2 and N4 to color the actual mice. And I probably would have used lighter shades if I had them, but N2 and 4 are the only ones I have. And I thought that the N series markers matched my paper better than the C series. So anyway, I went with N2 and N4. I think it worked out okay. And then for the squirrel and the rabbit, I used E13 and E15. And I did really, really basic coloring, so I'm just speeding through it. Okay, so hang in here with me. We're almost to the point of assembly. I decided to do one more decorative item on the front panel, and that is to take the mountaintop dies and die cut them out of some white glitter cardstock just to add a little bit more interest and sparkle. I didn't want to add any extra dimension, so I am just using the Nouveau glue that I used earlier, and because the paper is sitting on top of the cardstock, these pieces just notch right in there, almost like a puzzle piece. And I wish I had thought of this before I die cut the circle from the center of my card, but it's okay. I'm just going to use some scissors and trim around a little bit, and it's not going to show anyway, so it's not a big deal. Okay, so now this is the part where I should have done my stamping of my sentiment on the front of my card, but I didn't think of it, so do all your stamping on your front panel before you start assembly. So to start assembly, first thing I'm doing is lining up the panel that has the notch cut out of it with the card base and punching the notch in the card base as well. And then I am going to take the scallop circle that I prepared before, and I'm going to make sure my foam squares are facing down. I'm going to line everything up really well, so I want that brad right in the center of the circle that I have die cut on the front panel, and then I just line the front panel to the card base and press down. So this attaches the scallop circle to the card base, and then I'm going to add a good number of foam squares to the front of my card base. I don't want the scallop circle to get smushed because then it won't turn well, and so I'm placing a good number. You could use foam tape for this as well, of course. Then I just remove all my little backers and very, very carefully align my front panel to the card base and press it down. Now I'm taking one more foam square and I'm going to cut it in half. I need something to attach my critters to the card with. So you want to make sure that you do not put any foam squares or foam tape over the brad, and you want to make sure they also don't touch the edges of the circle that's die cut. I'm going to attach the critters to the 1 3/4 circle that I punched earlier, and I'm just going to use a little bit of the Nouveau glue, and the key here is just to make sure that you only put glue in the areas that are going to touch the circle. Mainly because you don't want the critters sticking to your work surface, but you won't be able to see the back of the critters once they're attached to the card, so it doesn't matter if you do get a little extra glue on there. It was at this point that it dawned on me that I had no sentiment on the front of my card, and I figured it wouldn't work, but I thought I would give it a shot and try to stamp it now. And of course it didn't go very well, so I resorted to stamping the sentiment onto a separate piece of white cardstock and fussy cutting it and then gluing it down onto the card front. I then peeled the paper from the foam squares and lined up the circle that has the critters on it with the brad, and there it is, the card in action. This is so much fun. I love it. It is a fairly simple design, and I apologize, I do jump around a little bit in this video, but the assembly of the card is really not hard. The last thing to do is to add an embellishment to the center of the critter piece so that you don't see the brad. So I used a Stampin' Up! Die set to cut out a snowflake, and of course you could still see the brad. So then I just took that 1-inch circle punch that I had used before and punched a scrap piece of the paper that I'm using on this card and glued the circle to the back of the snowflake and then place that onto the card so as to cover up the brad. The very last thing I did on this card was take the little arrow from the Push Here stamp set from Lawn Fawn and stamped it around the notch on the front of the card. And this could have ended badly, but I think because there were no foam squares in this area of the card, the stamping came out just fine. So that is it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and that you give this kind of card a try. I think it's a fairly easy assembly and you don't need a lot of special tools, and you can use this design for any kind of occasion whatsoever. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.